In a city of millions, defined by its towering skyline and relentless energy, some stories don't just fall through the cracks, they're swallowed whole by the shadows. She was a student, a daughter, she was just starting her life, and then she was gone. A few years later, another young woman with the same blonde hair and the same bright future vanished, and then another and another. For years, a chilling question has hung over Chicago and its sprawling suburbs. Was a pattern emerging? This is an investigation into the women who disappeared, the cold cases they left behind, and the terrifying possibility that while the city was looking for a monster, the real predator was the system itself. Welcome to Chicago, a city of industry, of culture, of brutal winters and beautiful summers. But beneath the surface of any metropolis, there are currents of darkness. Back in the 1970s and 80s, Chicago was a city on edge. Crime rates were climbing, and the police force was grappling with its own internal demons, often stretched to its breaking point. It was in that environment that a series of baffling disappearances began, cases that on their own were tragic mysteries, but when you look at them together, they start to paint a picture that's hard to ignore. The victims were young, they were ambitious, and in a detail that feels too specific to be a coincidence, many of them were blonde. These weren't women on the fringes of society, they were daughters, students, and professionals, plucked from their everyday lives, from bars, from their own neighbourhoods, from the supposed safety of the suburbs. Now, it's critical to say that law enforcement has never officially linked these cases. To them, each file is a separate tragedy, a unique puzzle. But for the families, journalists, and armchair detectives who have stared at the timelines and the victim photos, the similarities scream out from the silence of these decades-old files. The public began to whisper about a blonde woman killer, a ghost who knew how to pick his victims and leave almost nothing behind. That theory raises two equally terrifying possibilities. The first is that a serial predator was, in fact, actively hunting in the Chicagoland area for years. The second is perhaps even more chilling, that the system designed to protect these women was so broken, so fragmented, and so indifferent that it allowed separate tragedies to stack up one by one without ever connecting the dots. This is a story about the women who disappeared, the agonising weight their families have endured, and the failures that may have allowed a predator or predators to flourish. Our timeline of terror begins not in Chicago, but about 2 hours north in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. While geographically separate, this case serves as a dark prelude, the first chilling note in a symphony of horror that would soon echo closer to home. It was Halloween night, 1973. 9-year-old Lisa Ann French was dressed as a hobo, her face painted with freckles, a paper bag in hand. She stepped out of her house around 5:45 p.m, headed for a neighbourhood party just a short walk away. She would never make it. In those days, trick-or-treating alone wasn't unheard of, a symbol of a trust that was about to be irrevocably shattered. Lisa's path led her to the door of a neighbour, 24-year-old Gerald Miles Turner Jr. He was a familiar face, a man they thought they could trust. Lisa's younger sister later recalled that Lisa used to play with his baby. According to Turner's own confession, when Lisa rang his doorbell, he lured her inside. He sexually assaulted and killed the 9-year-old girl. Interrupted by his girlfriend arriving home, he hid Lisa's body and later that night drove her out to a rural farm field, dumping her body over a fence. When Lisa didn't return, a massive search was launched. More than 5,000 volunteers scoured the area. The search came to a heartbreaking end 3 days later. A farmer discovered 2 garbage bags in his field. One held her costume, the other held Lisa. An autopsy confirmed she had died from asphyxiation. The murder sent shockwaves through the community. From the beginning, investigators suspected Gerald Turner, but for 9 agonising months, the case went cold. He denied everything. Then, forensic technology, still in its infancy, provided a crucial break. Fibres found on Lisa's body matched the bedspread in Turner's bedroom. The pressure mounted, and in August 1974, he finally confessed. In 1975, he was convicted and sentenced to just 38.5 years in prison, a sentence that felt like a profound injustice. The case of the Halloween killer not only destroyed a family, but stripped a community of its innocence. It showed just how easily a predator could hide in plain sight, wearing the mask of a friendly neighbour. A decade later, in April 1983, the fear struck again, this time much closer to Chicago, in the suburb of Elgin. The victim was 23-year-old Karen Scheepers, a bright young computer programmer. She was out with co-workers at a local bar celebrating a promotion. Karen left the bar around 1 a.m. She was seen getting into her car, a distinctive canary yellow 1980 Toyota Celica, and then she was gone. No activity on her bank accounts, no ransom demands. Karen Scheepers and her yellow Toyota had vanished without a trace. The investigation hit a wall almost immediately. Police questioned her ex-fiancé, whom she had broken up with just 2 weeks prior. He passed a lie detector test and was cleared. There were no signs of foul play, no witnesses to an abduction, just silence. For nearly 42 years, that silence was all Karen's family had. Her father, a pilot, rented a small plane to conduct his own aerial search, desperately scanning for her yellow car, but he found nothing. The case grew cold, another dusty file on a shelf, and then, in 2025, a stunning breakthrough. The Elgin Police Department's Cold Case Unit had started a podcast and dedicated an episode to Karen's case, theorising she might have ended up in a body of water. They partnered with Chaos Divers, a volunteer group specialising in sonar searches. On March 24th, 2025, they got a hit in the Fox River. It was a car, and the licence plate matched. It was Karen Scheepers' Toyota. When they pulled the rusted vehicle from the river, they found human remains inside. But this discovery came with a shocking revelation. A local fisherman approached an officer at the scene. He told them he had detected the exact same object with his own sonar back in 2022, 3 years earlier. He'd reported it to the Elgin Fire Department, who sent a dive team, but that team prematurely determined it was just a small ATV or UTV, and the Elgin Police, the agency in charge of Karen's case, were never informed. For 3 years, Karen's car and her remains sat at the bottom of the river because of a critical breakdown in communication. The Elgin Fire Chief later issued a sincere apology, admitting more should have been done. The discovery brought a degree of closure, but it also laid bare a devastating systemic failure. After more than 40 years, a family finally had an answer, but one tainted by inexcusable error. Less than 2 months before Karen Scheepers vanished, another horrific crime struck a different Chicago suburb, one that would become one of the most infamous cases in Illinois history. The victim was 10-year-old Janine Nicarico. On February 25th, 1983, Janine was homesick with the flu in the wealthy, safe suburb of Naperville. That afternoon, someone kicked in the front door of her home. She was abducted, raped, and brutally murdered. Her body was found 2 days later, wrapped in a blanket. The community was horrified, and the pressure on law enforcement was immense. This pressure led investigators down a path of tunnel vision and wrongful prosecution that would ruin innocent lives and let a monster walk free. With no physical evidence, the state's attorney's office zeroed in on 3 local men: Rolando Cruz, Alejandro Hernandez, and Stephen Buckley. Despite a weak case built on questionable testimony, Cruz and Hernandez were convicted and sentenced to death in 1985. Then came a bombshell. A man named Brian Dugan, already in custody for other rapes and murders, confessed that he, and he alone, had killed Janine Nicarico. He provided details only the killer could know. It should have stopped the prosecution in its tracks. It didn't. Prosecutors, unwilling to admit a catastrophic mistake, dismissed Dugan's confession and continued to pursue the innocent men for years. It took a decade of appeals and tireless work by defense attorneys and journalists to unravel the injustice. Rolando Cruz was finally acquitted in 1995 after a police officer recanted his testimony. The charges against Hernandez were dropped. These men had spent over a decade on death row for a crime they did not commit. The case became a national symbol of the justice system's failures, contributing to Illinois' eventual moratorium on the death penalty. Finally, in 2005, DNA technology allowed prosecutors to do what they should have done 20 years earlier. They indicted Brian Dugan. His DNA was a match. The Nicaragua case, while solved, is an essential part of this story. It reveals a system so fixated on securing a conviction that it ignored a confession from a serial killer. If they could miss something so obvious, what other clues were they missing? What other patterns were they failing to see? So, is the story of the disappearing blonde women of Chicago real, or is it a coincidence? For years, the spectre of a blonde woman killer has haunted the area, a narrative fueled by chilling similarities. But what if the real predator wasn't a single man, but a broken system? This is where we have to confront a difficult truth known as missing white woman syndrome. The media and public's disproportionate focus on cases involving young, white women, while cases of missing people of colour are largely ignored. The disappearances of women like Karen Scheepers are heartbreaking tragedies, but they are not the whole story. In fact, they're a tiny fraction of it. A groundbreaking 2023 investigation by the Invisible Institute and City Bureau pulled back the curtain on who really goes missing in Chicago, and the findings are staggering. Over the past 2 decades, black people have made up about 2/3 of all missing person cases in the city. The numbers for young black women are even more shocking. Black girls and women between 10 and 20 years old account for roughly 30% of all missing person cases in Chicago, despite making up just 2% of the city's population, according to the report. This isn't a pattern, it's an epidemic that has been raging in plain sight. The investigation uncovered a pattern of neglect within the Chicago Police Department. Families of missing black individuals reported being dismissed by officers and illegally forced to wait before filing a report. The investigation found cases where police prematurely closed investigations even when the person was later found murdered. The report also found that police were still using paper reports for missing persons, and nearly half of recent cases were missing key data. This shoddy record keeping makes it nearly impossible to identify patterns or hold the department accountable. The case of Dorothy Glanton perfectly illustrates these failures. In December 1987, the 71-year-old black woman walked out of her Chicago home and vanished. 4 months later, human remains washed ashore on Lake Michigan. For 37 years, she was known only as New Buffalo Jane Doe. Initial authorities in 1988 believed the remains belonged to a white woman in her 40s or 50s. It wasn't until 2023, when the case was reopened with the DNA Doe Project, that the truth was uncovered. Genetic genealogy revealed that Jane Doe was Dorothy Glanton. The initial misidentification of her race and age highlights the scientific limits of the time, but also a potential bias. Her case languished for decades. During that time, a relative placed a heartbreaking ad in a newspaper for Dorothy's elderly mother. It read, "Your mother is ill, lonely, and afraid. She needs you desperately." By the time the ad was published, Dorothy's body had already been found. No one knew it was her. The mystery of Chicago's disappearing blonde women is part of a much larger, more devastating story. It's a story of a system that prioritizes certain victims over others, a media that reflects those biases, and a police department whose failures have allowed countless cases to go cold. Many of these cases remain unsolved, and families have waited decades for answers. Justice is still possible. If you have any information, no matter how small you think it might be, about the disappearances of Karen Scheepers or any other unsolved case in the Chicago area, please do the right thing. Contact the Chicago Police Department or the Illinois State Police. For every person who goes missing, there is a family that never stops searching. And for the disproportionate number of black women and girls who vanish, organisations like the Black and Missing Foundation are dedicated to bringing them home. A city's history is written in headlines, but its heart is found in the stories that are whispered. The stories of the faces on lampposts, of the empty seats at dinner tables, of the questions that hang in the air for generations. The story of the disappearing women of Chicago is one of those whispers, a chilling tale of eerie coincidences, bright futures cut short, and a pattern that was either never seen or simply never prioritised. Was there a lone predator stalking the suburbs, or was the monster something far more insidious, a fractured and biased system that failed to connect dots, mishandled evidence, and, through its own indifference, created the perfect hunting ground? The truth likely lies somewhere in that murky space between. The cases of Lisa Ann French and Janine Nicarico were solved, but not before the system inflicted its own trauma through wrongful convictions and delayed justice. For Karen Sheepers, the discovery of her car after 42 years brings a painful closure, tainted by the knowledge that a clue sat at the bottom of a river for years, ignored. And for every story we've told, there are thousands more that never make the news. The silent epidemic of missing black women and girls in Chicago is a testament to a deep, systemic failure to value all lives equally. Their stories are not just statistics, they are tragedies, compounded by neglect. The mystery of the disappearing women of Chicago is more than a collection of cold cases. It's a painful reminder that for the families of the lost, this isn't the city of big shoulders. It's the city of lingering questions. Their search continues, and for those who are still out there, their stories are not over. They are just waiting, like a whisper on the wind, for someone to finally listen.